Great. Hello and welcome to this live webinar organized by the Arab Organization for Human Rights on the Palestinian struggle to protect their human rights. We will be taking a special look at Sheikh Jarrah, which of course became a major issue during spring. The situation there, of course, is not very difficult to understand. It's a perfect illustration of settler colonialism, a microcosm of the reality for Palestinians across the 70 years and their experience with Zionism for the past 73 years. It is also a perfect illustration of the apartheid, which we've come to hear about so much recently, especially following the landmark reports by the Human Rights Organization, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, earlier in the year. How does, for example, an American citizen, this applies to Sheikh Jarrah, have the right to dispossess and kick out a Palestinian who's been living in their home for decades? How does, for example, a Palestinian citizen of Israel not get the same right to reclaim the home from which they were expelled and kicked out in the same way as a Jewish citizen does within Israel? So these are all really contrasting examples showing exactly how settler colonialism works within the microcosm of Sheikh Jarrah. And we will be taking a closer look at that. And we've got a number of great speakers, many of whom are from the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah itself in Jerusalem, and also lawyers and barristers from here in the UK. But to begin with, we will start off with a presentation by Zakaria Ode. Zakaria is a coordinator for the Civil Coalition for Palestinian Rights in Jerusalem, and he will be speaking about how Israel employs its own laws against the Palestinians in the case of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. If I could remind the speakers, though, I will give you 5 to 7 minutes to speak, and then I may interrupt. And following our conversation, we will have a discussion where I will allow our guests to ask questions, and I may also ask questions to you as well. So over to you, Zakaria. You can get us running.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for all the organizers who really make this meeting taking place. In fact, my name is Zakaria Ode. I am coordinator of the Civic for Human Rights Coalition that are working, or our work is really focused on the human rights situation in Jerusalem. We have been really monitoring the Israeli plans, Israeli policies in occupied East Jerusalem, and as well we try to provide some legal intervention. And one of our main work and focus is international legal advocacy. So I am going to speak. I mean, I will be speaking about the whole situation in Jerusalem, not just Sheikh Jarrah, because Allah Salami, who will be speaking about Sheikh Jarrah. So I will highlight about the human rights situation in Jerusalem. Because I mean, what's going on or what we are facing, we are really facing a colonial settler apartheid regime. And that's why always we say, if we talk about occupation, we undermine what's going on, because it's really more, what's going on is more than occupation. Jerusalem has been always the focus of the Israeli settler colonial policies and regimes since the first day of the occupation. Jerusalem has been really the focus, not only since the Israeli occupation in 1967, but even since 1947, since the Nakba and the establishment of the Israeli state. It's just, I want to go through some historical station where, as you know, maybe in 1947, according to the partition plan, Jerusalem was decided should be under an international umbrella. But as you know, as a result of the war of the Nakba, Jerusalem was divided, and nearly 70 to 80,000 Palestinians were displaced and became refugees. And 38 villages out of 42 villages were destroyed completely. And Jerusalem was divided. During 1967, Israel occupied East Jerusalem, part of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So all Jerusalem was under the Israeli occupation. Soon after the occupation, Israel took various laws and decisions where it ended by the annexation of East Jerusalem. I mean, the first decision was to expand the border of the city of Jerusalem, to annex land from the surrounding villages. And the second one, to expand the mandate of the Israeli Jerusalem municipality on East Jerusalem. And this was as well institutionalized by a Knesset resolution in 1980, where they declared that East and West Jerusalem is the united capital of the state of Israel. So this was really the framework that Israel has established. And since then, all the policies, all the practices that Israel has been really implementing is based on that East Jerusalem is part of the united capital of the state of Israel. It's important to say that during the last 2 years and during even the COVID-19, in spite of the COVID-19, Jerusalem has been witnessing a big increase and an escalation of the Israeli policies, the Israeli practices, which is mainly, land confiscation, building settlements, home demolition, and all these policies. Of course, this policies has been increasing during the last few years as a result of the previous American administration, Trump. We know that Trump has encouraged a lot the Israeli government in its policy, by declaring that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. And then the American administration, they moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They stopped the funding to UNRWA, and they stopped as well the funding to the hospitals in occupied East Jerusalem. I mean, during the previous American administration, which encouraged the Israelis more and more to go on with its colonial policy. It's very important, to highlight the main policies. It's important to know that today Israel control and use 87% of the land of occupied East Jerusalem. Mainly for building settlement, there are 15 settlements or colonies in East Jerusalem, which was occupied in 1967. Nearly 220 Jewish settlers, they live in East Jerusalem, and only 13% of the land in East Jerusalem, Palestinians are using, or they can use to apply for building houses and things like that. So the shortage of land as a result of the Israeli land confiscation policy, which has been going on since the first day of the Israeli occupation, of course, this affected the housing availability for the Palestinians. So there has been...
Zakaria, sorry to interrupt. Can you open your camera, please? Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's good, thank you.
So I am sorry. Yeah. So that have been affecting the housing availability for the Palestinians, in addition to the restriction on obtaining building permits for the Palestinians. I mean, it is very complicated. There are a lot of restriction on obtaining building permit, and because of that, there is a shortage of housing for the Palestinians. Because as well, Palestinians have no choice but to build without a permit. Today there are nearly 222,000 house or unit which has been built without a permit. And according to the Israeli laws, all these homes or houses are under the risk of demolition. As well, as well, during, just to mention that only in 2020, 170 structures were demolished in East Jerusalem, including 104 residential, displacing 385 Palestinians, including 180 children. That's only on 1 year, which is 2020. And even, as I mentioned before, even in spite of the COVID-19 and the health crisis that we have been going through, all of us as Palestinians and others. So all these policies of land confiscation, building settlements, housing right, denying housing right, denying housing permit, obtaining permit for the Palestinian, it's really part of what it's been called as the demographic control policy that Israel has been implemented. Always the Israeli strategy that there should be a small minority of Palestinian Arabs vis-a-vis a majority of Jewish Israelis in Jerusalem. And so part of this policy is the Israeli discriminatory urban planning policy as well, which has been, the Israeli urban planning policy has always one objective or one goal, is to increase the settlements and the settlers occupied in Jerusalem, and how to reduce the number of the Palestinians who are living in the city of Jerusalem. And especially these days, there are various plans that Israeli government, Israeli institution has put, which really aiming to force displace the Palestinian. One of the main plan is what they call it, the city center of East Jerusalem. This is one of the major plans. There is the other plan, what they call it, Wadi Silcom, or in Wadi al-Joz, which will lead to the destruction of 200 establishment, businesses in the city of Jerusalem. And today we are facing another plan or another policy that Israel is starting to, what they call it, land settlement and land registration. Since 1967, there has been no land entitlement or registration in East Jerusalem. It's just in 2018, the Israeli government, they decide to start land registration and land resettlement. What does that mean? That means it will activate the absentee property law, and where any property that the owners are not residents of Jerusalem, it will be transferred to the ownership of the Israeli government, to the Israeli Keren, they call it the Keren Kayemet, and the Jewish National Fund, where all this property will be transferred to their ownership. According to some estimation, nearly 60 to 65% of the property in occupied East Jerusalem, their owners are not residents of the city of Jerusalem. And according to that, they will be considered absent. Even if one member of the family is not residents of the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli government will take control even of one share of the property in East Jerusalem. So we call it, this is really like the second Nakba that Palestinians are going to face in the city of Jerusalem, because as we said, most of the property will be taken over or will be controlled by the Israeli government and the Israeli institution. So, we talk about land confiscation, building settlement. During the year 2020, nearly 5,000 settlement unit has been approved and put for implementation in occupied Jerusalem. So there has been 4 or 5 settlements projects. The strategy of approving and building settlements in occupied Jerusalem is that they are the strategy to surround the city of Jerusalem with settlement and to separate the city of Jerusalem from its extension in the West Bank, from the south, from Bethlehem and Hebron, from the east, to separate it from the Jordan Valley and Jericho, and from the north, from Ramallah and the north of the West Bank. So the strategy, they are surrounding the city of Jerusalem with settlement. They are expanding the settlement inside the city of Jerusalem. So the Palestinian neighborhood will be like, you know, the Swiss cheese, these cheese with the holes. So will be like ghettos surrounded by settlement, by bus roads, light tram, by cable cars, and by the settlements as well. So this is the strategy, which it has the aim or the objective to change the Arab-Palestinian character of the city, and part of what we call it Judaization of the city of Jerusalem through land control, home demolition, building settlement. And part of these plans is like the eviction or the forced displacement of Sheikh Jarrah, the forced displacement of Silwan. You know, in Silwan only, there are 5.
I can ask you to wrap up. If I can ask you to wrap up,
okay.
Zakaria, sorry.
On Silwan only, there are 5 sub-neighborhoods whom are facing either demolition or eviction. So, I mean, it's important when we talk about either Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan to look at the general and big picture of what's going on on Jerusalem, to look at the colonial settler apartheid system that is going on in occupied East Jerusalem. So just to finish, that all this going on under really the eye of the international community, and Israel continue with its policy of discrimination, policy of land confiscation, building settlement, because there is no serious action by the international community. There is no serious action by the European state or by, we know the Americans, they are really the main ally of the Israeli states. I mean, you know, always we say that US is the main allies, but during Trump, the US was a partnership to the Israeli governments in all the policies, in all what has been doing in East Jerusalem. Therefore, I think your voice is very important. Your effort is very important to put pressure on the European governments and all the governments in order to stop the continuous and systematic Israeli colonial settler apartheid regime in all Palestine and in Jerusalem in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakaria. It's always great to have a voice from Jerusalem speaking about the creeping annexation and slow ethnic cleansing within the holy city. I think you've presented the historical picture and also the background to the annexation and the matrix of control, as it's known, really eloquently. But we also, and I think it leads nicely onto my next speaker, who will provide us with a more descriptive account of what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah specifically. And that will be Ala Salaima. Ala is a member of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Family is threatened with dispossession from their home. So over to you, Ala.
At the beginning, I would like to thank you for hosting me in this seminar. Assalamu alaikum jami'an, for all of you. I'm Ala Salaima, 25 years old, living in Sheikh Jarrah most of my life. And it's not just a house that I lived in, it's a home. So I'm one of those people who threatened by ethnic cleansing, as well as 28 more other families here in Sheikh Jarrah. That means more than 500 people threatened to be homeless. I'm going to assume that not everyone here knows about Sheikh Jarrah historically. So I will briefly tell you about Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood case. Our case started in 1954 when an agreement was reached between the Jordanian government and UNRWA to establish a housing project of 28 refugee family whom were displaced in 1948 from Haifa, Jaffa, and East Jerusalem. In 1956, UNRWA chose 28 families. 28 families would give up their refugees card and benefits to place them here in Sheikh Jarrah. An agreement between us as the families and the Jordanian government signed, which stipulated that they would receive legal title to the property in 3 years, assuming that during that time they paid a nominal rent. We as family to pay the nominal rent and forfeited their refugee ration cards. Despite having fulfilled the terms of the contract, we as families who lived in Sheikh Jarrah did not receive legal title to the land yet from Jordanian side. Then in we still lived here until 1967 peacefully. After that, after Israel occupation, Sheikh Jarrah became a target of Jewish settlers. The settlers themselves occupied one of the homes whose owner was abroad and gained control of the cave in our neighborhood here in Sheikh Jarrah. And in 1972, two settlers organizations claimed ownership of the land in Sheikh Jarrah since 1885. Based on their president on Uthman Kushan, a property registration document that is the evidence of a preliminary from the ownership. This Kushan document did not meet land, location, and border criteria required for formal ownership title. Nevertheless, several of the 28 Sheikh Jarrah families began receiving eviction requests of rental payment from two settlers organizations. And here, legal proceedings began on this basis, and action aimed to remove our families from our homes were undertaken. In 2028 and 29, four families were forced evicted, including this family was Fawziya al-Kurd, Al-Ghawi, Hannoun, and part of Nabil al-Kurd home, without any evidence of settlers' ownership of these houses. Today, all Sheikh Jarrah families are threatened by forced ethnic cleansing by settler. I would like to mention that we're dealing with Israeli court not because we believe that it's a just and non-biased court, but we have no other option. So we have to deal with Israel court. In the last few months, the world has known the case of Sheikh Jarrah because we use social media to make our voices heard, and our suffering be visible by international community that could stand in the way of Israel's crimes and violation in occupied Jerusalem. This is the first. Second, to hold Israel accountable for its eviction policy. And the third aim, all states are to abstain from assisting their Israel violations and make action on the ground to stop Israel outbreak on our lands. So this is my words. And the last things I want to say it, that I want to stay in my home. It's our history, our land, our homes, our memories. So I will fight about my home and my land and my Sheikh Jarrah because it's mine and for my people. So thank you for listening to me. And this is the last thing. Nasim.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you for that moving presentation. Very informative. Gave us a very good background to where things are with Sheikh Jarrah. But ultimately, of course, this isn't a property dispute or dispute over tenancy. This is really an issue about, does Israel have any right to make judgments on Sheikh Jarrah? Given that it is an occupied territory under international law, it doesn't have any right to actually even judge over.
We have to deal with this code because we have no options.
Yeah, that's because you are forced to. You have no other option, but that is the case. But I will raise a number of questions which we can get to later on. But I do want to move swiftly and change topics slightly and bring in one of our special guests, Jim Moran. Jim is a former US congressman. He has said he has to leave soon, so I want to get him in and hear what he has to say. Jim, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nasim. I actually am very much interested in this dialogue, and I will stay as long as you want me to. It's that important. I want to thank Zakaria. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, sir, and Ala Salema. Everything that Zakaria mentioned, history is true. It can be documented, and it's a story of gross injustice. And Ms. Salame is living in the midst of that continuing injustice. And I don't think it's going to get any better under Mr. Bennett. In fact, the state of Israel is becoming more right-wing, more nationalist. More settlers are coming into the country from places like Brooklyn and the like. They're more orthodox. They're more extreme, and they seem to be more arrogant in terms of their alleged right to take land from the people who are legitimately living on that land. My problem, though, is that I think and I fear that we are speaking to the choir, preaching to the choir, if you will. And the choir has no power to change things. We can feel upset, angry, but an injustice should make us upset and angry and determined to do something about it, to correct that injustice. But the reality on the ground today is that that injustice is going to continue. And the only way that it's going to change is that the choir, who are willing to listen to these facts of the history and what's happening on the ground today, are empowered to make a difference. And the way you get power is through money and votes. It's financial and political power. And the choir, who are interested in this, who care about this, don't have that power. They've lost their leverage. I think the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis have basically thrown the Palestinians and their cause under the bus, to use an American term, concretizes, solidifies that reality. So I think that we need a different approach. I listen to this and I feel as upset as I do when I listen to the history recounted of the indigenous people of America, Native Americans. They actually prefer to be called Indian Americans, so I'll call them as they choose to be called, but they suffered horrible injustice. They were slaughtered. There was ethnic cleansing that took place virtually over the entire continent. And today, a small minority even live on the reservations that they were forced into. But what they're doing is going into casinos, gambling, if you will, which was anathema to their philosophy, but they're also moving into the cities and getting better health care and better education and better employment opportunity. Their story is one of gross injustice, but it's also one of human nature. And it's comparable to what has happened to the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been confined to reservations, and those reservations are becoming smaller and smaller. And some people have referred to them as open air prisons. And in some ways, that description is not inaccurate. So I think we need to figure out a better approach. I think we've got to figure out how to acquire more financial influence and particularly more political influence. That's going to be up to the Palestinians, their leadership. But Palestinian leadership is almost an oxymoron today. The Palestinians are not united. There is too much evidence of corruption, of backstabbing among different groups, and that only strengthens the ability of those who want to wipe the Palestinians off the map, or at least deprive them of all their land and all their resources, and particularly the political influence. So I think the Palestinian people are going to have to speak with one more united voice. They're going to have to be less corrupt than Caesar's wife, if you will, to use another silly expression. They're not going to be able to give any excuse for people who want to perpetuate this injustice. So I'm kind of in the camp of Peter Beinart, who is an American thinker who has rallied a number of thoughtful young people in the United States. A lot of them liberal young Jewish people who care about this issue. They were probably the only real solution is probably a one-state solution at this point, because the Palestinians have lost. They've lost their leverage, and I think they're going to continue to lose until we try a different approach. What is happening in the Arab community that Allah spoke of is just one more anecdotal example of what is going to continue to happen when the Israelis realize they have all the power and influence, even among Arab nations today, with the exception of Qatar. So that's my take. It sounds cynical, but I just don't see a way out of this injustice and a path toward the kind of peace and prosperity that the Palestinian people deserve.
Thank you, Jim, for that sober reflection. It was, I think you've presented the challenges Palestinians face really eloquently, and I think it is a sober reflection. But I wonder, though, if you think, Palestinians never had the power, they never had the money. And I'm wondering whether even despite those challenges, there has been a shift. Palestinian support for the Palestinians has always been from bottom up. It's never been top down. And with Black Lives Matter, with progressive movements that are, gathering pace around, not just in the US, across the world, I'm wondering, and Palestine really is at the forefront of those progressive movements. You mentioned Peter Beinart as well. And we also see the bipartisan support in Congress kind of weakening as well. So I'm wondering if things are shifting despite the fact that Palestinians don't have the traditional access to power through money, through in politics, let's just say. And maybe you can hold on to the answer for now, but maybe something you can reflect on before giving us the answer at the end of the presentation by my other guests. But it's just something that came to my mind, and I wanted to put that to you before, now as opposed to later. But while you think about that, Jim, I want to go to our next speaker, Asel. Asel is a Palestinian activist. she has been raising awareness about the Palestinian issue on social media and Sheikh Jarrah over recent many years. So I'd like to, pass the microphone over to Asel.
Thank you, Mr. Nassim. May I ask, first of all, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. And how many minutes do I have? Just so that I set up the timer.
I gave the speaker 7 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes, but I'll be flexible with that, but 7 to 8 minutes.
No problem. Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you so much for organizing this session. I think it's a very important discussion that we're having. And I would like to also thank Mr. Zakaria, Miss Ala, who's my friend. I'd like to consider her my friend, and also Mr. Jim. I do have more of a positive notes that I'd like to share, especially when it comes to Sheikh Jarrah's story. You introduced me as a Palestinian activist. I would rather use accidental activist, and I'm going to explain why.
Okay.
My father is from Tul Karim. He was ethnically cleansed when he was 7 years old in Al-Naqsa in 1967. He had to walk with his family to Jordan, Irbid in Jordan. And my maternal grandparents were also ethnically cleansed from Jerusalem in 1948. And they had to walk to Al-Salt in Jordan. Why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story to, first of all, tell you about what is it like to be a Palestinian in the diaspora, some of the things that we face on a daily basis, and then I'm going to go into how we work on raising awareness through social media. And I want to comment, if that's okay, at the end about the point that Mr. Jim has mentioned about empowerment of Palestinian people. He mentioned the pillars, money and votes, and I want to add one more pillar to it, and that I think is positively impacting what's happening right now these days. So first off, the accidental part. I grew up listening to the story of how my father and my mother's family were ethnically cleansed in Palestine. And throughout the years, while I was growing up, the only feelings that I had were, sadness, fear, helplessness, strong feeling of helplessness. Every time they bombed Gaza, all I was able to do was cry and pray for our martyrs and pray for Palestinian people to have a better future. But what happened in Sheikh Jarrah was honestly, I see it as a miracle, because it awakened the Palestinian identity was awakened, especially amongst the youth in the diaspora. Special sense of pride has sprung out of that crime that the occupation is attempting on our people in Sheikh Jarrah. Suddenly, you would see people that were kind of ashamed to say that they were Palestinian, and I don't blame them because of the discrimination that we face on a daily basis the moment you say the word Palestinian, especially when you are living in the Western world. Suddenly, they were so proud of being Palestinian. Everybody wanted to chip in. Everybody wanted to talk about Palestine and to talk about the atrocities that the colonial occupation is committing upon our people. And I see that as the silver lining, because I see the difference with my own eyes in the various age groups, but in particular in the youth, of how much they are more proud, as I mentioned, and they are trying to do something, and they are trying to amplify the voices of our people on the ground. Now I want to move a bit to the point that Mr. Jim mentioned, because I believe there are 3 pillars that can stem from, empowerment comes from 3 main things, in my opinion: money, votes, but also knowledge. Knowledge is very important, and the occupation has been working for years and years on separating Palestinians. You see Palestinians in the diaspora, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, in the 48, and also trying to hide and conceal the truth about what's happening on the ground. So I think one of the most important things that we need to work on as Palestinians is to increase our knowledge and awareness about what's happening on the ground. And so I want to move to what can we do and how we can use social media. We saw that Sheikh Jarrah, everybody is, or rather, for me not to exaggerate, a lot of people are talking about Sheikh Jarrah now. And obviously what we have done collectively when it comes to social media contributed to that. But it's very important for us, all of us, to be always aware about what's happening on the ground, to have people that you speak with on a daily basis to tell you what exactly is happening, especially with, as I mentioned, the execution of the truth that happens on the social media and the press. And I think the more we know about what's happening on the ground and the more we build up knowledge, whether on history, on the main events that happened in Palestine, the more we are able to make an impact. What I always say, and I work a lot with groups of people, I'm not sure if everyone is aware of that platform, but on Clubhouse, we do a lot of rooms in which we talk about Palestine, whether in Arabic or English, in both languages. And something that I always see is that, as I mentioned, people want to do things, a lot of things, but sometimes they lack the knowledge. So in my opinion, one of the most important things is to build up knowledge, to build up awareness, and then to focus on the other two pillars that Mr. Jim spoke about, and those are the money and the votes. It's very important for us to continue to use social media to amplify the voices of the people on the ground, to tag government officials if we are living in the Western world, for example, to hold them accountable for what's happening, and to continue to be united, and at least in that front of exposing the crimes of the occupation. I hope I didn't take much
No,
time.
that's perfect. That's fine. Thank you. That's fine. That's perfect.
You're welcome.
Thank
No
you for
problem.
such a.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the positive, upbeat presentation. I think, as we know, politics is always the last to respond to changes in culture, changes in society, changes in civilization. Politics is always very slow to react, and I think we have seen shifts, and we are slowly seeing shifts in politics as well. But we'll probably talk about that a bit more later on, because one of our guests has to leave, guests from Palestine. Maryam Afifi, and I want to get her in before she leaves. Maryam is a Palestinian musician, and she became famous during the Sheikh Jarrah, the expulsion, so to speak. She was arrested, as many of us seen the video footage went viral, and she became known as the Palestinian smiley person. So I'm very pleased and honored to have her on our show tonight. So Maryam, over to you.
Hello, thank you for hosting me. I'm Maryam Afifi, as you said. I'm a musician from Jerusalem, Palestine. So I want to talk more generally about our situation as Palestinians in Jerusalem. So our main struggle today as Palestinians from Jerusalem is to fight the ongoing Israeli efforts to erase us and to erase our existence from this city. These efforts have been ongoing since 1948 until today. In 1948, all the Palestinian neighborhoods that were in the western side of Jerusalem were occupied, emptied from their Palestinian owners. Massacres took place and whole neighborhoods, cities, and villages were emptied. After 1948, those Palestinians that were left in Jerusalem that hadn't been killed or displaced have been dealing with the ongoing attempts of displacement by the Israeli occupation. It's not a secret, nor it is private, that Israel has declared to be a Jewish national home, continuing the long-lasting project that started in the late 19th century, which is Zionism. And I want to make it clear that opposing Zionism does not mean opposing the Jewish religion or being anti-Semitic, as Zionism is not a religious project, it is a colonial project. So today, in line with the massacres and the use of force, Israel uses its biased courts as a powerful weapon in order to legitimize its policies of ethnic cleansing and forcible displacement. These biased courts have been working for so long to serve one goal, and this goal is to include more lands with and to exclude as much Palestinians, like more lands, less people, less Palestinians. Include and steal as much place and exclude as many Palestinians. Today, we Palestinians in Jerusalem consist of 40% of the population. The tactics to empty us vary in different forms. One of the forms is the one you are hearing about now, that is taking place in Sheikh Jarrah and the neighborhood of Silwan in Jerusalem. They are performing ethnic cleansing against whole neighborhoods using different methods and excuses. In Sheikh Jarrah, as you all know, 28 families are facing the risk of being displaced if we haven't protested for more than 4 months in Sheikh Jarrah, and their cause has not been talked about everywhere in the world. They would have been displaced already since the month of May. As 4 families were already displaced from the neighborhood back in 2009. In Silwan, which consists of different neighborhoods, each neighborhood had its own cause. For example, in Al-Bustan neighborhood in Silwan, they want to demolish 100 houses in 50 dunams to recreate the David City Park, which means 1,550 people will be displaced. In Al-Batn al-Hawa neighborhood in Silwan, 750 Palestinians will be displaced in order to bring settlers from the US or Europe to take their place. They are planning to demolish another 280 houses in the Wadi Asul neighborhood in order to build the streets that connect the Israeli settlements and outposts together. Of course, under international law, this is all illegal. But as you know, it's not a legal state. It's not a legal case. It is a political case. It's a colonial case. Another way they use is to exclude some Palestinian neighborhoods and residentials away from Jerusalem by building a wall that we call the annexation and expansion wall. This wall prevents the Palestinians in these areas from entering Jerusalem, cutting them off. If you have a look at the root of the wall, the way it is built, you will see how literally their main goal is to include as much land and to exclude as many Palestinians. And they give us Palestinians in Jerusalem a special legal status, as we are considered residents but not citizens, and our residency is permanent. They would deny us Palestinians from having any Palestinian institution or organization or whatsoever. They would prevent us from doing any act that would express our, let's call it Palestinianship in Jerusalem. They would attack us and arrest us if we raised a Palestinian flag or organized a Palestinian event or activities. This actually has recently become a way we use for resistance. The Israeli occupation has long been counting on its ability to silence us and to silence the international community when it comes to the crimes it practices against us Palestinians. It has long been sieging our voices and our stories and occupying the powerful news platforms around the world, spreading its propaganda. It did not expect that we, the Palestinians, without any support, could reach the world through our different social media platforms, showing the world what's taking place here through our own eyes, voices, and the cameras in our phones. We Palestinians fear that a day will come that we will not be able to call ourselves Palestinians anymore, or to refer to our place as Palestine. If you open any map today, digital or paper, as much as you would search, you will not find the name Palestine. We are being erased from the maps as well as from any international platform or document. Facebook and Instagram has deleted posts and photos of the Palestinian passport that was issued during the British Mandate period to 1948. Before deleting them, they considered them as sensitive content. Like, tell me, what is sensitive about the name Palestine or the word Palestinians? Remember that Palestine is not the issue of Palestinians alone. It is shameful that we are in 2021 and occupation, colonialism is still ongoing. Everyone should stand in the face of colonialism and occupation. We as Palestinians resist through any way possible. We choose to resist in order to confirm that we exist. We refuse to be erased. Everyone should talk about Palestine. Israel should be sanctioned. Free people around the world should push their governments, should go down to streets and demonstrate. It's not something that Palestinians should only stand for. It's something that all humans should stand for. How can occupation, oppression, colonialism still be ongoing until today? And I want, the last thing I want to talk about, that for us Palestinian, peace is not the issue. Equality is not the issue. It is freedom. Freedom is the right and only question and answer. You cannot ask someone who lives under occupation, who lives under discrimination, why don't you make peace with your oppressor who neglects your right as Palestinian, creating unlivable conditions which are intended to uproot Palestinians from their land, while basic human rights are violated on a daily basis. We as Palestinians resist through everything, aiming only for freedom, through music, through dancing, through art, through literature. I am a musician in the Palestine Youth Orchestra. We tour the world to show everyone that Palestine still exists. Many think that there was no such thing as Palestine after 1948, but we still exist. Everyone should talk about Palestine. Everyone should show the world that it still exists. They try to erase us from history. We should show them, everyone should show them that they cannot.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you for this really powerful presentation. I think just listening to you, I really see how you embody this idea of sumud, what Palestinians call steadfastness. And I think you do that really well with your voice and with your music, and really delighted to hear you speak on that. We have come to the end of our speakers. So I wanted to open up the floor for anyone that wants to come in, ask a question, clarify a few things. If not, we will. I will ask questions going back to Jim, and also I'd like to hear if Jim has a response he wants to make to Ala. Does anyone have a question they want to come in and ask before I move on?
Team, I think you
joined us.
I've been here the whole time.
Oh, so la. Oh,
sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot that mine.
Yeah. Oh, I am so sorry. Yeah.
So I couldn't understand why you hadn't, because I'm not going to be able to stay for too much longer. So.
Oh, Salma, sorry. I saw
right.
Lala. I didn't realize it was. I was messaging you actually, by the way, to find out if you had joined us. In any case, that's fine. I'd like to ask Salma Yaqub to give her presentation. Salma is a barrister from the UK. We've asked her to join us, and last minute she's been able to join us. So. Sorry about that, and yeah, please go ahead and give us your thoughts.
Don't worry, Nassim. I'll keep it very brief anyway, because we've had some very, very interesting and informative interventions so far. I think I just wanted to make three main points, really. It's already been touched on, but it's just to kind of remind, I think, everybody that when we're talking about the case of the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, although there's a legal case at the center of it all, I think in reality this is a political as opposed to a legal issue, and that has been touched on, of course, by the other speakers, but that it's part of a concerted effort to Judaize Jerusalem by the Israeli authorities and by settler groups, and that in and of itself is part of a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing that, as we know, Israel has perpetrated since its establishment and continues to do today. And I think that, both sort of Israeli propaganda, but also the way that the media covers it means that quite often we end up shrinking our perspective and removing context and getting caught up in the details of the Sheikh Jarrah case, which are very, very important. But I think Israel always wants us to narrow our focus and concentrate on the rights and wrongs of a particular situation and the chronology of a particular case. Whereas what we really need to do always is to take a step back, as I'm sure many of us already do, and to see this in its broader context. And I think that attempt by Israel to strip issues that happen in Israel-Palestine of context has to be resisted. The second point I wanted to make, and it has also of course been made by other speakers, is that the Sheikh Jarrah incident is, as we know, really symptomatic of Israel's status as a settler colonial state that's practicing apartheid, and that has been practicing settler colonialism and apartheid since its establishment. And all of the incidents that happen, from Sheikh Jarrah to the settlements across the West Bank, to the attempts to, in quote unquote, Judaize the Naqab desert, which is inside Israel proper, can only really be understood by viewing Israel through the prism of a settler colonial regime, because that is what it is. And I think that Jim Moran mentioned the similarities between Israel's efforts to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from their land with the history of the indigenous people of the Americas. And in a sense, what we're dealing with here, I suppose, is an attempted ethnic cleansing in the form of settler colonial regimes that have occurred in the past, but in the 21st century, one that's not completed, that's ongoing, and where the indigenous population, for various reasons, have been better able to resist, and where what is acceptable to the international community has changed to a certain degree. So I think Israel hasn't been able to complete its ethnic cleansing in the way that other settler colonial states have. But the problem is there's the ever-present threat that it will complete its ethnic cleansing. And of course, there's the ever-present attempt by Israeli authorities to do so, and which causes all the suffering on the ground that we see. And I think the third point I wanted to make is, given that Sheikh Jarrah is systematic of Israel's status as a settler colonial state, that's really the message that needs to be driven home constantly, I think, to the UK government, to other governments around the world, and to the international community in general. The narrative that portrays Israel as, in effect, a normal state, which might have a poor human rights record, or which might have some problems, or which is in the midst of a conflict that hasn't been resolved, is misleading at best. I think we constantly need to refocus the message and drive home the message that Israel is a settler colonial state, and as a result, it has specific types of policies which are endemic, which are systemic, and which set it apart from ordinary regimes. Not to say that other states don't do bad things, or that other nation states are perfect. I'm not suggesting that by any means, but I'm saying that Israel, in many ways, is set apart in that way. It is not a kind of typical state, and it shouldn't be considered in those terms. And so if it is a state that's practicing settler colonialism and apartheid, then the UK government and other governments have an obligation to deal with it very differently to the way they would deal with other countries. We have concepts in international law that the rules against colonialism, the prohibition against colonialism and apartheid, are called peremptory norms of international law. And if a state violates those norms in the way that Israel does, then there are obligations on the other states in the international community not to assist that state in continuing to carry out its violations, and to actually make concerted efforts to end that situation of colonialism or apartheid. So in other words, for example, the UK government has an obligation, not just only a moral, but also a legal obligation, to take steps to to remove the support it provides to Israel, which we know is manifold, and also to start to deal with it in the way that it should, a state that exists outside of the ordinary rules of the international order. And so I just think that, it's important for all of us to focus that message to the UK government and to others in the international community that Israel is a special case and it requires a special treatment as a result. So I think I'll leave it at that, Nassim.
Thank you, Salma. I mean, we got your thoughts in the end. I think it was really useful having your legal perspective on this discussion. I know you have to leave, but do you want to answer just one quick question for me then, before you go? I mean, you mentioned Israel is a special case, and Western governments have to deal with Israel differently if they were to classify Israel as an apartheid state or a state that's carrying out ethnic cleansing. We know that determination has been made by human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem. We may even have a scenario where the ICC makes a determination that Israel is actually carrying out guilty of apartheid and ethnic cleansing and whatnot. So even after all these determinations by various organizations and institutions, can the British government, can the US still say, no, that's their opinion, our opinion is that it's not, and things will just be as normal? How would that play out?
Well, unfortunately, I think there's two layers to it. So the kinds of determinations that are made by human rights organizations, unfortunately, although they're very persuasive and they lend a lot of credibility to the case that Israel's practicing apartheid, the reality is that governments can choose to ignore that and say, well, we come to a different opinion because, they're not judicial bodies. Technically speaking, the UK shouldn't be ignoring a ruling by the ICC, for example, because the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is a body that the UK has signed up to by treaty, and it's obligated to respect and help enforce, facilitate decisions of the ICC, in fact. So it would be definitely, as a matter of realpolitik, I can imagine the UK government ignoring a determination by the ICC. But as a matter of treaty law, they shouldn't. Similarly, if the UN Security Council made a decision, which clearly it wouldn't because of the problems with the Security Council, but if it did, Israel is practicing apartheid, then all members of the UN would have to comply with that. And same with the International Court of Justice. But what we're dealing with is a question, unfortunately, of reality. And we know in reality, the UK government and other governments can just ignore international rulings. They can go against the grain. And it's just a question really of us using any decisions that are made at the international level to add weight, to add power to the arguments that we make, that the government should respect those decisions and should start treating Israel as a special case. And what I'm advocating for really is just a focusing of the message on those kinds of key points.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you very much. If anyone has a question, feel free. If not, I'd like to go back to Jim right now and wonder if he has any thoughts on the question I posed to him earlier.
Before you go back to Jim, there's a question rising from an aspect which both Jim has touched on and Lala just now.
Sure.
I've got a question because I'm not going to present a particular piece, but I would participate. My question is this: what is the composition of the population from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan?
So that's a question from Nick Squires. He's a solicitor and a senior lecturer.
You could put my video on. You've switched it off, but I don't mind.
No, you could turn your video back on if you want. I think someone's turned it off. I can't do it from here, but if you can turn your video on. But in any case, I mean, the question was, Jim, again, what is the population breakdown from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea? That's the question, yeah?
I mean, I can answer that, or does somebody else want to answer that?
Yeah.
I don't.
Go for it.
Who it's directed to. I mean, from my understanding, the latest data is you've essentially now got a situation where 50% Palestinian Arabs, 50% Israeli Jews living between the river and the sea, as we call it. So that's the reality. I mean, you have one, in reality, on the ground, you have one state exercising power that it can, and control de facto over the whole territory, and you've got a population that's 50-50 as things stand at the moment.
Yeah. So I think six. Yeah, I think 6
points.
No, I think the numbers are something like 6 point something million, 6 point something million, both sides, and it amounts to 12 million altogether. And then, as you pointed out, that presents a very challenging scenario for Israel. You know, what they call the demographic challenge. You will get to a situation in a few years' time where Palestinians are likely to outnumber Israelis in what is historic Palestine. So, yes, so that's, I think, the answer to your question, Nicholas.
And my point was, going back to Jim, I mean, he said the Palestinian leadership, which have been their own worst enemies. I mean, you can 48, 67, but the two-state solution, Arafat was able to go away with that, but they rejected it. So they've lost. But the Israelis, because of that demographic we've just seen, are on borrowed time. Because if, as Jim has said, it's now a one-state solution, then the Israelis are in trouble because they are going to be a minority in a wider Arab population.
Yes, that is correct. But I'm not too sure if Arafat walked away from a solution. I think that there's conflicting narratives as to why that failed. One of the arguments is that Palestinians were never offered the basic guarantees of their human rights, like, for example, the right of return, East Jerusalem, cessation of settlement. So those basic things were not really offered. So that's the perspective you'll get from the Palestinians if we look back in the other narrative. But of course, the narrative that's pushed regularly here in Europe and the West is that the Palestinians never failed to miss an opportunity for peace. That's been the narrative, but the details are a bit more murky when it comes to that issue. But Jim, do you want to come back on that? Do you want to add anything to this point?
Yes, I do, actually. Let me first say that I've been extremely impressed with all of your speakers. And that speaks well of you, Nassim, if you chose the speakers, because they are...
AOHR did. I shouldn't take the credit. AOHR selected the speakers.
Well, whoever...
I know them, though.
Give the credit to whoever deserves it, but the reality is that they are all well-informed, obviously intelligent, and I find them all compelling because it's not just a recitation of facts. You can feel the emotion in what they say because it's an acknowledgement of the injustice that has taken place, and it can be factually proven. So I don't take issue with any of the speakers. I think they're wonderful, and I wish I could take every word they've said and publish it around the world. And I think it would probably make some difference. And I'm particularly impressed with the young women. And I think Edward Said recognized that if there is going to be an insistence upon justice, it's going to have to come from young people who are willing to risk their careers, even their lives, in the pursuit of that justice. That's what happened in the civil rights movement in the United States. But let me give you some figures that I find to be very compelling and would underscore the point I was trying to make. There are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. So we've got a population of nearly 8 billion, and almost 1/4 of them are Muslims. There are 200 million Arabs in the world. There are less than 15 million Jewish people in the world. There are about 6 million Palestinians. So when I talk about leverage coming from money and coming from political power, the Muslim community and the Arab community have it, but they have chosen not to use it. And that's what troubles me. Now, if you speak to any Muslim, they're going to almost any, not MBS or MBZ, but most of the populations that they control will, not General Sisi, but most of Egypt will attest to an intense desire to see justice for the Palestinians. And yet it doesn't happen. Yet the Muslim community seems to almost be intimidated by the small, relatively small number of Zionists, Jewish, not all Jewish people by any means are Zionists, but those who believe in a nationalism, believe in the ethnic cleansing of Israel, and it seems like there are more and more people elected to lead Israel who believe in that. And yet, how can this small number of people ensure that there's no pushback from nearly 1/4 of the world's population, or even from the 200 million Arabs that live in the region? What's happening? Well, what's happening is that there is no democracy. There is no democratic voice. And that's what I'm trying to get at. The money is there. The political influence is there. The leadership is not. The unity is not. And the corruption is. So that's what I find to be most troubling. And I've been listening to this and understanding it, believing it, getting exercised about it for 40 years in politics. And it's almost cost me elections time and time again from the few people in our community who are believe that Israel's right to exist is threatened, and that the only way that it can be secured is to push Palestinians out of their homes. And yet I've seen very little achieved by even exposing the facts. So I think it shouldn't be up to me. Obviously, this Gentile who an American ex-politician, but it just seems to me that the Muslim community and the Arab community need to look within themselves and say, what's this about? I got to tell you, I'll say one more thing. I used to take some really tough votes with regard to what was happening in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. And I did them because it was the right thing to do. But in my district, we had a fair population of Muslims and Arabs, not anywhere near as influential. But on election day, I would go out and I'd, obviously seeking votes, and I'd go to the coffee shops, and they'd be exercised, obviously, about what was the newest injustice that took place in Israel. And I say, incidentally, guys, did you vote? It was always guys. Did you vote today? No. They were far more interested in sitting, drinking coffee, and complaining among themselves than even going to the polls to vote. And that's what's so frustrating to this American politician. So that's what I wanted to share. You asked me.
No, that's fine. That's thank you for that, Jim. I think why we haven't, or the Muslim world hasn't been able to square that circle. That's a huge question. I think part of the reason is what you've alluded to, I think, which is that, they've inherited a political system which really isn't a reflection of their self-determination and their freedoms. Go for it, Zakaria. You want to come in?
Yes, in fact, I agree with our friend, really. And even we feel frustrated. We feel like left. Just to correct the number, the Arabs are 430 million, not even 250. The Arabs only. And
Thank you. I'm going to correct that. Thank you,
because
Zakaria.
the issue is a political issue. I mean, most Arab regimes are controlled either by the American administration or by the US. and or by Europeans, I mean like Britain or other countries. So all these regimes are really connected to this global or international community in a way or another, where most of them are really created by the ex-colonial powers who were really ruling in the different Arab countries. And that's why at the time where people are struggling, at the time where Palestinians, we are struggling, at the time where Palestinians are going through all these crimes, all these atrocities, we see some Arab Gulf states have already starting creating relation with the state of Israel. They have been started normalization and start their relation, different relations with the colonial settler apartheid regime. It's true. I mean, we are more frustrated than you. But also, it's very important to mention Israel is not just a few Zionists. Israel was established by the European country. It was established by Europe, by the support of the Europeans. It has been supported by Europe and the US all the time. So Israel is not just Israel. Israel really a state which was created by the imperialist country, by the colonial, the ex-colonial powers who are European states and the Americans, and they are still supporting them. I mean, we believe that Israel can't continue, will not be able to continue committing all these atrocities, all these crimes, if the Americans will not continue to provide all these financial, military, and economic support to Israel.
Zakaria, can I take issue with that? I want to call you my friend because I like you and I like where you're coming from.
Thank you.
But frankly, there are as many Muslims, not Arabs, but Muslims in the United States as there are Israeli, pro-Israel Jewish folk. But the political influence is vastly disproportionate. And it's almost a culture. So the history of the past can't be an excuse for the state of the present. We know this. We know the truth of what you're saying. So let's do something about it. And it's just not happening sufficiently in the United States or in Europe. I'm aware of the colonial approach. I'm aware of the fact that what the British and the Americans did to Mossadegh in Iran and what that caused, and the deals that were made by the Saudi royal family. Sure, that happened, but that can't excuse us for giving up today and rectifying that history of injustice. That's all I wanted to say.
But these states, just one comment. These states are still controlled by the US and the other European countries. They are not really independent. And they look like independent, but they are not independent. They are controlled. It's not necessary by military, but even economically, politically. So our conflict is not a religious conflict. It's not a Muslim and Jewish. No, it's a political. It's, as we say, it's a colonial.
Thank you, Zakaria. I think we're getting diverted from the original theme of the presentation. I wanted to quickly end with where we started off with Sheikh Jarrah and get some thoughts on where we are with the tenants there, with the Palestinians who are in threat of eviction, I mean. The Israeli courts has said that they have been granted a protected tenant status. What does that mean? And the US has also said they should not be evicted. So can you give us some feedback on that, Zakaria? What's the situation now? Or if anyone else wants to come in and speak to that, please do.
You know, as a result or because of the movement on the ground, I don't know, we call it the uprising, we call it Habba, which started during the last few months, especially during Ramadan. And after that, we started not in Jerusalem. First, it was, a protest in Damascus Gate against the Israeli police, against the Israeli restriction and procedures. Then it spread in all over Jerusalem. Then the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, the eviction came as well. And it spread in all the West Bank, in all Palestine, even in the Arab cities, in what's so-called the 48 or the Green Area. So we never witnessed or seen the Palestinians united in this way between the river and the sea, in their protest, in their rejection to the Israeli colonial settler apartheid regime. So resistance, demonstration, marches were everywhere in all the cities, Haifa, Jaffa, Nazareth, Led, and in Jenin, Tul Karim, Nablus, and even in the refugee camps in the Arab countries. And you remember the day of the general strike, which never happened since 1936, which united the geography and the people everywhere, the Palestinians everywhere, were participated in this general strike against the Israeli policies, against the Israeli policies in Sheikh Jarrah, the forced displacement. So as a result of that, the case as well with the solidarity of the international solidarity all over Europe, in the US, everywhere. So the issue of Sheikh Jarrah became a global issue. And it's not only it became a global issue, as well it put the Palestinian issue like on the top of the agenda after it was really neglected and ignored. So as a result, this really has a big impact on the international community, on the states. And that's why there has been a lot of pressure by the EU, the European states, but even by the American administration, who several times they made statement, they requested from the Israeli government not to evict the families in Sheikh Jarrah. And because of that, because they don't want another intifada on the ground, they don't want the resistance which started and took place to go on and to continue against the Israeli colonial settler apartheid regime. Because of that, there has been a lot of pressure by the American administration, by the European state on the state of Israel. And, because of other issues related as well to the, with the relation between the Israeli government led by Bennett with the Americans, like there are other issues like Iran and other Syria and other issue, Russia, China. So there is a kind of like negotiations, or I don't know what to call it, on this issue, where I think the Israelis, they thought, okay, let's try to find a solution. So in the last hearing in the court, when it was in the High Court, because to discuss the appeal against the eviction, it was very clear, can you imagine the head of the High Court? He talked several times. We don't want to discuss law. We are not here to take a legal decision. We don't want to discuss that or to look at that. We are here to find a diplomatic solution. We want to reach some kind of understanding where the families will not be evicted, and at the same time, we can't ignore all the legal proceeding that has been going on for 50 years. There are several legal decisions that has been taken. So he suggested, the judge suggested that, okay, let's accept, can you accept that the families to be protected tenant? This protected tenant, it's an previous British system where people can be protected. They can stay in their homes for 3 generations, where nobody can evict them. So this is one of the system or the mechanism that Israel has been using here in really dealing with the situation with the different Palestinian areas, especially Jerusalem. So he suggested the judge, okay, the families are protected, they can stay in their homes for 3 generations. But you know, according to this law or to this procedure, if the settlers, what does that mean? That means that the settlers are the owners and the families or the residents are a tenant. What does that mean? If tomorrow the settlers have a plan to build a settlement, which we know that the settler company, Nahlat Shamon, that is taking the families for eviction to the court, they have a plan to build a settlement of 225 units to replace the houses where in Sheikh Jarrah. So if tomorrow they take they finish all the proceeding, all the papers to build the settlement, they can evict the families. You know, and the judge gave the people to think about it, and they told them, okay, I need to receive your answer about that. Of course, the families and the lawyers of the families, mainly the families, they refused this offer. They refused to acknowledge and to accept that the settlers or the settler association is the owner of the land, because the settlers for 50 years of legal proceeding, although as we said, we believe that the issue is apolitical, is not really illegal. So for 50 years, the settler couldn't prove that they own the land. And even with the document or the cushion that Allah talk about, that the settlers they have, the lawyers, they went to Turkey, to Ankara, and they checked on the archive in Turkey, but they didn't find any original of the Israeli settlers document or kushan or tabu, whatever registration document that they have or they claim. So, and even they went to Jordan, and there was no, even in the archive in Jordan, there is no any proof that they own the land. I mean, all of us, we believe if really they really prove that they own the land, they would have evicted the families long time ago. Yani the issue started in 1972. We are now in 2021.
Thank you, Zakaria. Sorry, I want to quickly wrap up if you can. Yeah.
Yeah. So the families, they refused to acknowledge, they refused to this offer. And then as well, the settlers, they refused as well the offer that the judge gave or both, that to accept that the family are protected for 3 generations. So now is left for the court, for the judge. So the judge, I think, will organize a hearing, will appoint a hearing, and we don't know when, where he will discuss and they will take a decision. If the court will decide to reject the appeal, then the decision will go back to the district court and the eviction will be executed of the families, of the 7 families now who are under this eviction orders. If not, we don't know, that maybe the judge that will take another kind of resolution or decision, which will not push for eviction, because we know very well that they are under a lot of pressure. And that was very clear during the last hearing at the High Court, and from all the statement by the different Israeli officials. You know, as we said, there was even some kind of news 2 days, 3 days ago that Bennett or the Israeli government are asking the United States or the US administration to put pressure on the Palestinian to accept this deal. So we don't know what will happen really. We are waiting for the
I think that's a good summary of that. That's fine, thank you. And I think the main point there is that this is really a political issue and not a legal one. And we've had a political victory by blocking their expulsion. And it shows that the Palestinian issue really isn't something that should be led by the media. Ethnic cleansing is a daily issue, and the people around the world need to pay attention to what's going on a daily basis, so that we can have small political victories like the one we've had in Sheikh Jarrah. I think we've run out of time, and I think we've had a really great conversation, which we didn't just touch upon Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. A lot of the wider aspects of the Palestinian issue was discussed, and I'm really delighted to have taken part in that. So I want to thank all my guests, Zakaria, Asel, Ala, Mariam, Jim, and Nick, and of course Salma Karmi. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for organizing it.
Yes. Thank you, Nassim, and thank you, Zakaria.